Oh, hello. Welcome to the exciting world of obligations and contracts. Today, we will talk about obligations. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm Dean Rod Vera. I'm a law school professor and a dean of a college of law. I will explain obligations as part of the subject obligations and contracts in the perspective of a professor, not necessarily as a lawyer, but as somebody who teaches this subject. I will break it down into parts that are easier to understand and segments where it will be easy for you to comprehend. Bear in mind, I'm not replacing your professor. You will still have to attend class and use this video as just a guide or a helping tool as you study obligations and contracts. Now, what are obligations? Basically, obligations are promises from one person to another. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that obligations, second only to the family, are the basis of society. Without the trust and confidence that people will do their obligations, I think society will break down. Obligations and contracts are part of our civil code, which is the codification of the laws, regulations, and norms that one must follow in a civil society, hence the word civil code. There are three parts to an obligation. There are the elements, its sources, and its effects. Now, in this video, I will just give you the basic principles of obligations. Use what you'll learn in this video to help you when you review or at least when you prepare for class. The first two elements are the subjects. There's the active subject and the passive subject. Active subject, or let's call him the creditor, is the one that receives or benefits from the obligation. The passive subject is the doer of the obligation. Let's call him the debtor, which means the obligation is towards the debtor to do what he has promised to do. The third element of obligation is the object. What is the promise? There are basically three objects: to do, to give, or not to do. The fourth element is the juridical tie. It is what binds the two parties together, the creditor and the debtor. That juridical tie is the essence of trust and how a debtor will perform what he obliges or what he promises to do. The fifth element is the cause. Why was the obligation created? What was the reason for the obligation? Why is the cause important? It's because when there's a dispute, people want to find out why these two people or why this one person entered into that obligation. The second element of obligation is or are the sources. Where do obligations come from? Basically, there are five sources of obligations. The first one is the law. The law tells us what is incumbent upon us. One of the basic obligations provided by law or mandated by law is taxation. We have to pay our fair share to the government. Without any contract, without any agreement, as long as we are the citizen or a resident of the country, we have to pay the tax that is charged to us. A second source of obligation is a contract, which is going to be part two of this series. Because this video is about obligations, I will make another video on contracts. When that is done, there will be a link up here or at least a link in the description below. So a contract basically is an agreement between two parties, and that contract is filled with obligations on one of the parties to do or to give something. A third element is what we call, or what the law calls, a quasi-contract, meaning it is an obligation not based on an agreement, but based on what the law tells that you have to do. One of them is unjust enrichment, meaning you can't get rich or take advantage of somebody. The law provides through a contract that you must return what is not yours or what you gained unjustly. A fourth source of obligation is crime, or what we call delicts if you're in law school. If you are found guilty of a crime, you have an obligation to restitution, pay for damages, and your obligation to society is either to pay a fine or to go to jail. So, technically, crime does pay, but nevertheless, don't do anything. Don't break the law. The fifth source of obligation is what the law calls quasi-delict, or in other words, negligence. The rule on quasi-delict or negligence is that if there is negligence on one debtor, he then owes that creditor at least restitution or at least to repair the damage caused by that negligence. Now let's go to the effects. The first effect of an obligation is to give. That means you have to deliver an object or to deliver whatever is agreed upon. Like for now, when you order something online, the person who sells you that item is obliged to deliver that item to you, whether at your home, at your office, or at the pickup point. The second effect is what I like to call the Macbeth Principle. It is to do or not to do. In an obligation to do, one promises to perform a task. In an obligation not to do, one promises or undertakes not to do anything. For example, if the speed limit is over 100, you promise or you undertake or you have an obligation not to go over 100 kilometers an hour. A third effect of obligations are the fruits. Think of fruits as what is naturally the outcome of an obligation or an object that is part of the obligation. What the law provides is that once the obligation starts, whatever is born out of that object must be included in the delivery of that object. For example, if you promise to deliver a plant and it happens to be a rose or tomato plant, if there is a fruit that comes out of it, that must be included in the delivery of that plant. Another effect of obligation are the accessories and accessions. For example, if you promise to deliver a car, you must bring with it the tires, the seats, the steering wheel, the engine. You can't just deliver the body of a car. If you buy a laptop, you must include the screen, the hard disk, the keyboard. So therefore, these things must be or are necessarily included in the obligation. So now let's go to kinds of obligations. The law generally includes 6 types or kinds of obligation. The first obligation is what we call a pure obligation. A pure obligation is one that does not have any attachment, meaning it is a pure promise, a pure undertaking to do, to give, or not to do. It is not based or contingent on any other factor, such as an event or a time period. A pure obligation technically is demandable at once, meaning the creditor, who is the receiver of the obligation, can demand the debtor to perform or to deliver the obligation. A subclass of a pure obligation is what they call a conditional obligation, meaning when the condition happens or the condition occurs, then the obligation becomes demandable at once, meaning that the condition there is the starting point of the obligation, which is a pure obligation. Another kind of obligation is what we call a period obligation, meaning the obligation is tied up with a date, a time period, or a future event. For example, if there's an obligation to deliver an item after the Super Bowl or after the NBA championship, then that event triggers when the obligation must be performed. A third type or kind of obligation is what the law calls alternative obligation. An alternative obligation is that a debtor promises or undertakes to have 2 or more obligations, performances if you will, and the performance of one extinguishes or completes the obligation. Generally, the choice is with the debtor. If he has to choose between A, B, or C, the debtor doing the obligation or the of B will eliminate A and C. A fourth kind of obligation is what we call the joint and solidary obligation. In that type of obligation, it should involve at least 2 or more debtors, meaning in that promise to do something or to deliver something, it is then incumbent upon 2 or more actors or 2 or more passive subjects. The creditor here, or the active subject, can demand the obligation on one of the debtors. Meaning if that one debtor, let's say debtor A versus debtor B, if debtor A performs the obligation, as to the creditor, the obligation is extinguished. But between A and B, because there are 2 parties, the law provides without any other condition that they are equal shares. So A then can demand from B his share of the obligation. For example, if it's money and you have to deliver 100 pesos or $100, and A pays that $100 to the creditor, A can demand 50 or B's equal share in that obligation. A fifth type or kind of obligation is what we call a divisible or indivisible obligation. Usually it involves things or deliver items, such as maybe to deliver 50 sacks of rice or 50 bushels of apples. So technically you can divide the obligation. If the obligation is to deliver 50 things, you can partially perform it. So on the first month, you deliver 1/4 and then 1/4 again and 1/4 again. Here, the obligation is not extinguished on the partial performance or delivery of the items or the object. So that is a kind of obligation, meaning it can be divided into parts, and only the completion or the delivery of all the parts will extinguish the obligation. A sixth and most often seen in contracts is obligations with a penal clause, meaning if the debtor here fails to perform or breaks his promise in the obligation, it will come with it a fixed amount or a penal clause, as they say. Most contracts involve this because it is agreed upon between the parties, so that if the debtor fails to perform the obligation, A then, aside from asking the completion of the obligation, can demand the penal or the penalty that comes with the obligation with a penal clause. Hi, please do me a favor and smash that like button. It'll help me a lot and it will trigger the YouTube algorithm. Now, if you have not yet, please subscribe to my channel. If you don't, my dog will eat this exam booklet and that student has to repeat his final exam again.